"Can I play for food?" The question hovered like smoke in the chandelier-lit air, drawing silence from the tuxedoed crowd of Roosevelt Music Hall. Conversations faltered, champagne flutes froze mid-air, and all eyes turned toward the barefoot boy standing beneath the spotlight, palms together like a prayer. 13-year-old Evan Churchill stood in the grand lobby, dwarfed by marble columns and velvet ropes. His hoodie was threadbare, his jeans torn at the knees, and a smudge of soot crossed his cheek. He looked wildly out of place next to men in tailored suits and women in sequined gowns. A Steinway Grand waited on stage, polished to a mirror shine. Evan looked at it like a man lost at sea might look at a distant lighthouse. The event was a televised charity gala for youth music programs, an irony that bloomed darker with every second Evan stood there, ignored and out of place. "Where's this kid's chaperone?" someone muttered. A woman in a diamond necklace instinctively clutched her purse. Laughter tickled through the room like static. A man in opera gloves leaned in toward his date and whispered, "This some kind of publicity stunt?" At the front of the room, Gerald Whittaker, renowned pianist and the event star draw, lowered his champagne glass with a smirk. Candice Sterling, chairwoman of the gala, narrowed her eyes with professional concern. Whittaker stepped forward, amused. "Kid, this isn't the subway," he said lightly. "This is Roosevelt Hall. We don't do requests." But Evan didn't budge. He stood quietly, eyes fixed on the piano. No begging, no flinching. Just silence, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. From a few rows back, Dr. Lena Morales, music professor and former Juilliard examiner, tilted her head. She noticed Evan's stance, the way he shifted his weight, the way his fingers twitched slightly, instinctively, like someone already playing in his mind. Whittaker chuckled. "Tell you what," he said. "Why don't we give him a shot? Let's entertain the crowd." The audience clapped, more for the comedy than the courage. Candice smiled for the cameras, murmuring, "Let's not be cruel, Gerald. One song won't hurt." Evan walked toward the piano with calm purpose. His fingers hovered just above the keys, not yet touching. The crowd leaned forward, waiting for the spectacle of failure. But those who were truly listening, Dr. Morales among them, noticed something else. The stillness before sound. The kind that only comes from years of devotion, not days of desperation. They didn't know his name yet, or where he came from, or how music had saved him more times than any shelter ever could. They were about to find out. That night at Roosevelt Music Hall wasn't the beginning of Evan's story. Not really. But before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story makes you believe that nothing is impossible, if only you believe. It began years earlier, in the cracked tile basement of a Southside church, under the weathered hands of a gospel pianist the world never knew, but who taught Evan everything that mattered. Dorothy May. She played with her eyes closed, not because she couldn't see, but because the music didn't live in the sheet notes. It lived in the spaces between them, the breath between chords, the weight of silence before the spirit moved. To Evan, she was more than a grandmother. She was rhythm and grace and the smell of Sunday biscuits all wrapped in one. She called him Little Blue for the way he hummed blues riffs under his breath while brushing his teeth, while tying his shoes, while dreaming. The piano they played on had a cracked middle C and one stubborn pedal that stuck like glue. It sat uneven on the linoleum floor of Mount Zion Baptist Church, tucked behind the pulpit like a forgotten relic. But to Evan, it might as well have been Carnegie Hall. "You don't play for applause," Dorothy used to say. "You play to heal the air, and if you're lucky, to heal yourself too." He believed her. Every word. She taught him hymns first, then jazz runs, then one rainy Saturday Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. "If you can find the sorrow in this," she whispered, "you can play anything." He did. Even then, Evan played like he was searching for something he'd lost. Maybe home, maybe safety, maybe her approval. He never found all of it. But he came close. And then, one day, she was gone. It was a Tuesday morning. The kettle was still whistling when he found her slumped over on the worn sofa, an open hymnal in her lap. Heart failure, they said, fast, painless. But Evan never believed in painless. He was 10. The system took over after that. Social workers came. The church said a quiet goodbye. And Evan was sent into a new life built on paperwork and polite indifference. The first foster home was cold, clean, nothing to complain about on paper. But every kindness felt rehearsed. Every hug had an expiration date. The second home was worse. There were too many kids, too few rules, and one locked piano in the front room no one was allowed to touch. The third home never heard him speak. By the time Evan was 12, he'd stopped believing the word home meant anything. So he packed his backpack one night, 2 changes of clothes, his grandmother's broken wristwatch, and a crumpled church program with her name on it, and slipped into the streets of Chicago like a shadow. The trains became his shelter. Red line, blue line, brown. Anywhere that ran through the night, music became his currency. He'd find street pianos in tourist stations or fake them on subway platforms, tapping rhythms against the concrete and humming counterpoint into the air. Sometimes he was ignored, sometimes mocked. Once, a drunk businessman threw a cheeseburger at him mid-song, but other times, someone would stop, listen, drop $1 into his cup. And for a moment Evan felt seen. He slept on benches, sometimes under them, learned which shelters locked their doors early and which ones had soup left over. He grew thin but wiry, his fingers long and strong from hours pressing imaginary keys into the air. Music was his blanket, his heartbeat, the only thing that didn't ask for ID or paperwork or silence. There was one platform he came back to often, Jackson on the Red Line. The acoustics there bounced his voice off the tile walls, like he was inside a cathedral. One night during a thunderstorm, he played a bottle cap drum beat against the steel railing and sang an old hymn his grandma used to hum when she was worried. Someone recorded it on their phone. He didn't know that clip would later resurface, synced to his Roosevelt performance, in a viral edit with the caption, "He's been playing for survival longer than we've been watching." But that moment hadn't come yet. Back then he was still just a shadow slipping between city lights. A hungry boy with no nameplate, no family, no proof he mattered. Except for the music. Always the music. And that's what brought him to the doors of Roosevelt Music Hall. Not a plan, not ambition, just a piano. And the faint memory of a woman who once told him, "Play like the world needs saving, because someday it might." Evan was ready. He just didn't know the world was about to listen. Back in the glittering present of Roosevelt Music Hall, the boy stood center stage, still barefoot, still silent. A curiosity. That's all Evan was to them. A living headline. A viral moment waiting to happen. Some guests whispered bets on how many wrong notes he'd hit. Others pulled out phones, not to remember his name, but to catch his failure in 4K. Gerald Whittaker, standing beside the stage in his custom tux, soaked in the attention like champagne. He leaned forward and gave the crowd a playful wink. "Well then," he said with theatrical grace, "since you've insisted, young man, let's give the people a show." He turned back to Evan, raising his voice just enough for the cameras to catch. "Play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, first movement. I assume you've heard of it?" Chuckles rippled across the floor. Candace Sterling, ever aware of which side of her face caught the spotlight best, adjusted her posture and offered the boy a photogenic smile full of glossy pity. "Don't worry, darling," she said sweetly. "No one's expecting perfection." Evan said nothing. He simply looked at the piano. It was a Steinway Model D, the kind most children only see in magazines. Its black lacquer gleamed beneath the chandelier light. Whittaker stepped aside, gesturing dramatically as if inviting a guest into a royal court. "Go on then," he said. "Let's see what street talent looks like." Evan moved, one step at a time, slow and unbothered. The laughter faded a little with each footfall. By the time he reached the bench, the crowd wasn't sure if this was still a joke. He didn't sit right away. First, he ran one hand gently along the rim of the keys, like greeting an old friend. Then, with deliberate care, he adjusted the bench, exactly 1.5 inches forward. He rolled his shoulders, set his feet, positioned his hands in a relaxed curve above the keys, and still hadn't played a note. Somewhere near the back of the room, Dr. Lina Morales narrowed her eyes. She wasn't here to be entertained. She hadn't flown in from Boston for champagne and small talk. She was a lifelong educator, Juilliard alum, touring concert pianist, and currently a tenured professor at Northwestern. And what she saw on that stage didn't match the narrative forming in the room. She leaned forward. The boy's posture was textbook. His bench height, his breath control, the way his eyes didn't look at the crowd or the cameras, but straight down, into the keys as if they were telling him a secret. This wasn't a dare to him. It was a ritual. Whitaker, oblivious to the shift in energy, smirked and folded his arms. Candace Sterling tapped her nails against her champagne glass. The cameras rolled, phones tilted, and then Evan played. One note, then two. Then the room fell silent. The opening of Moonlight Sonata floated through the air, soft and haunting. Not just accurate, not just rehearsed, alive. He played like someone remembering a lost dream. Each note carried weight, sadness, elegance. His fingers glided over the keys with grace, far beyond his years, not showy, not hesitant, just real. Whispers stopped, phones lowered. Even the ice in drinks seemed to melt a little slower. Whitaker's arms dropped from his chest. Dr. Morales was already crying. She watched as Evan brought out subtleties in the piece that most students twice his age struggled to understand, phrasing that pulsed with quiet grief, rubato that swayed like breath. It wasn't imitation. It was interpretation. The kind you couldn't teach, the kind you had to survive to find. Candace Sterling's smile froze mid-camera pan. She glanced nervously toward the event producers. And still Evan played. The boy who had asked for food was now feeding the room something far more potent: truth. A few guests started to lean forward, unknowingly placing hands on their hearts. Others simply stared, transfixed, as if realizing for the first time that talent doesn't come dressed in tuxedos. It comes barefoot, it comes hungry, it comes with dirt on its face and music in its bones. And now it was here in their sacred hall, speaking through Beethoven in the voice of a Southside child with no last name in their programs. As the final notes faded, a silence deeper than any applause settled across the room. Evan sat still, hands hovering an inch above the keys, eyes closed. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He just breathed. And then he stood. Dr. Morales stood too, quietly, instinctively, her hands trembling, unsure whether to cry harder or applaud louder. The trap had been set for a joke. Instead, they'd just witnessed a revelation, and Evan hadn't even started speaking yet. It wasn't just music. What came from Evan's fingers didn't belong to notes on a page. It belonged to places words couldn't reach. The opening line of Moonlight Sonata unfolded like mist creeping across a lake, slow, mournful, achingly intimate. The laughter was already gone. No one spoke. No one dared. Because what they were hearing wasn't a child stumbling through a challenge. It was a confession whispered through ivory and echo. Each note seemed to hang in the air a fraction longer than expected, like it needed time to be understood. Gerald Whitaker's smirk melted first. He leaned forward, arms limp at his sides now, his practiced charm dissolving into something less certain. There was a flicker of disbelief behind his eyes, as if the instrument he had mastered was suddenly speaking a language he didn't know. Candace Sterling's smile faltered by measure 3. Her head tilted slightly, her lips parted, but no words came. The cameras caught it all. The shift from condescension to confusion, from certainty to unease. And in the 5th row, Dr. Lina Morales sat perfectly still, her fingertips pressed together in prayer at her lips. Her eyes welled. It wasn't just the clarity of Evan's technique, it was the shape of his sound. The way he floated through the left-hand arpeggios, letting the sustain pedal catch the echo just enough, but never too much. The phrasing, the restraint, the weight of someone who had learned silence before sound. This wasn't raw talent, this was refinement, born of solitude. The kind that grows in basements, not conservatories. Evan's hands moved like ghosts across the keys. Light touch, heavy meaning. He played as if the piano were a living thing that needed comfort. as if each chord had its own grief to confess. Dr. Morales knew this kind of sound. She'd only heard it once before, in a recording of a dying Polish pianist who hadn't performed publicly in 20 years. How does a boy this young find that kind of gravity? She already knew the answer. He hadn't found it. He had lived it. Evan's face didn't change. No drama. No flair. Just closed eyes and a furrowed brow, like he was holding something fragile in his chest that might shatter if the wrong note slipped out. Whitaker's jaw tightened. He glanced at the audience, searching for allies. But no one met his eyes. Their gazes were locked on the boy who had walked in barefoot and was now commanding a room full of polished professionals with nothing but the truth in his hands. Candice whispered something to the event coordinator, but it was too late for damage control. Evan reached the central theme of the sonata and played it with devastating simplicity. No embellishment, just raw feeling. A woman in the back wiped her eyes. A man near the bar slowly lowered his phone. There was a dignity in the way Evan shaped silence. He understood that rests were not pauses, but part of the message. His dynamics weren't about volume. They were about trust, about letting the piece speak for itself. It wasn't perfect, it was personal. And that's what stunned them most. Dr. Morales felt her throat tighten. Her own students, brilliant, privileged, practiced, rarely reached this level of surrender. This wasn't performance, this was communion. Whitaker looked down at his own hands, almost reflexively, like he'd forgotten something important, something he used to believe in before the fame, before the critics, before the standing ovations dulled his hunger. Evan finished the first movement and let the last chord hang. He didn't let the pedal carry it. He lifted his foot cleanly, allowing the sound to die on its own. The silence that followed felt heavier than applause. No one moved, no one breathed. Evan slowly lifted his hands from the keys, like releasing something sacred. He opened his eyes, took one look at the stunned crowd, and then stood. He didn't bow, he didn't smile. He simply turned to face them, arms relaxed, eyes steady. From somewhere near the center of the room, a single pair of hands began to clap. Dr. Morales. She stood as she applauded, and her voice cracked as she whispered, "Extraordinary." Then, like a wave, the room followed. Applause began, awkward at first, then rolling, then thunderous. But Evan remained still, his face unreadable. To him, the applause wasn't the point. He wasn't there for praise. He had just shown them the truth. The rest was noise. As the last claps echoed through the vaulted ceiling, Whitaker stepped forward, his expression unreadable. His voice, when he found it, came out hoarse. "Well, I didn't expect that." Neither did anyone else, except Evan. He had always known music would carry him somewhere far from nowhere, and tonight it had. But the most important part hadn't happened yet. He still had something to say. The final note dissolved into silence, not the kind that begged for applause, the kind that felt sacred. Evan's hands floated above the keys, then slowly came to rest in his lap. He waited, head bowed slightly as if listening for some unseen approval. Then, just as quietly as he had sat down, he rose. No bow, no smile. He stepped away from the Steinway with the same calm certainty that had carried him to it. Each footstep across the polished floor echoed in the breathless room. The lights shimmered, but no one blinked. No glass clinked. No whisper dared to break the spell. He stopped at center stage. For a moment, no one moved. Then a single clap cracked the silence. It came from Dr. Morales, her eyes still wet, her hands shaking. She clapped slowly, reverently, like someone applauding the sunrise. A moment later, another guest joined. Then another. And then the wave began. Applause surged from the back of the hall, swelling until it became a standing ovation. People rose to their feet, not out of obligation, but from something deeper, something like awe. The boy they had mocked had just stripped the room bare with nothing but music and truth. Even Whitaker clapped, hesitantly, unwillingly. His hands touched more out of instinct than conviction, and he couldn't quite meet Evan's gaze. Candice Sterling smiled again, but this time it wasn't the curated kind. It trembled at the corners, and through it all, Evan stood still. He waited for the applause to crest, And when it did, when the clapping reached its peak and began to taper, he reached down into his battered backpack and pulled out a small black wireless microphone. The sight of it alone cut the applause in half. He clicked it on, held it to his mouth, he said quietly, his voice soft but amplified, was for my grandma Dorothy May. The room fell dead silent again. She was the only person who ever believed I could be more than the streets. She taught me to play on a piano with broken keys and no pedal, said music could keep you human even when nothing else does. He scanned the faces in front of him, not with malice but with the quiet calm of someone who had already seen the worst and survived it. I didn't come here tonight for your sympathy, he said, or your applause. I came because people like me aren't supposed to end up on stages like this, not unless we're cleaning them. A murmur stirred, but no one dared interrupt. I came here, he said, because this night this room has been recorded. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. Evan nodded toward the corners of the hall where small, barely noticeable mounted cameras blinked red. Then toward the exit doors, where discreet crews had stood quietly all evening with audio packs and wide-angle lenses. Suddenly, the RSVP ticket disclosures came flooding back to those who had skimmed past them. By entering this event, you consent to filming and audio recording for educational and artistic purposes. I'm part of a documentary series, Evan continued, called Hidden Virtuosos, funded by the NEA, PBS, and a few people who still believe music belongs to everyone, not just the ones who can afford it. Now the cameras were no longer on Evan alone. They were turning, sweeping across the audience, capturing stunned faces, champagne frozen in mid-sip, guilt blooming in slow motion. You thought I was a prop, Evan said, or a joke, something to make your gala more dramatic. But I came to see how the arts world treats people who look like me when they don't know who's watching. He let that hang, and the silence that followed wasn't reverent this time. It was heavy. Dr. Morales stood straighter, pride glowing in her face like a quiet fire. Evan took a breath and lowered the mic just slightly. I didn't fake the hunger, he said, or the past. I've slept in subway stations, played on the street for food. This tux, someone gave it to me 3 hours ago. I still don't know their name. He took another breath. I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm here to remind you, talent isn't rare, access is. And with that, he clicked off the mic. The click echoed louder than it should have. No one moved. Evan stepped back, picked up his backpack, slid the mic into it like it was just another instrument, and stood there. The barefoot boy who had walked in from nowhere had just given them a night they would never forget. And he still hadn't left the stage. The mood snapped like a string pulled too tight. The applause had died. The illusion of control shattered. The room was no longer a stage. It was a mirror. Evan stood at the center of it, calm as ever, backpack slung over one shoulder, the mic now silent in his hand. He didn't need to say more, but he did. My name is Evan Churchill, he said, and I've spent the past year walking into rooms like this, uninvited, unwashed, unseen, and asking the same question. Can I play for food? He looked around at the chandeliered silence, and every time people laughed or scoffed or called security until the music changed their minds. He stepped forward toward the edge of the stage. The golden spotlight followed. I'm part of a national arts equity project called Hidden Virtuosos. It's funded by Public Arts Programs, PBS, the National Endowment for the Arts. Our goal is simple: expose how real talent gets ignored when it doesn't look like money, pedigree, or polish. He let the truth sink in. You weren't being tested. You were being revealed. Gasps rippled like wind through wheat. A few guests glanced at their phones, others glanced at the exits, but there was nowhere to run from a room this well lit. Evan nodded toward the mounted cameras, the handheld ones, the ceiling mics disguised as chandeliers. They hadn't been hidden. Not really, but no one had noticed. The moment you walked in tonight, he said, you gave your consent. It was buried in the RSVP agreement. You agreed to being filmed for an educational documentary. You agreed to audio recording, public broadcast, and journalistic use. Every word, every laugh, every face. Candace Sterling snapped. This is outrageous, she hissed, marching toward the stage in her 6-inch heels like a socialite heading into battle. "Turn off those cameras, now!" Evan didn't flinch. A cameraman zoomed in on her face. She noticed too late. "This is a private gala," she continued. "For charity, for the arts. This child, this setup, it's exploitation." Someone in the back muttered, "You didn't think that when he was entertainment?" Whitaker stepped forward next, voice tense, eyes scanning for his PR handler. "If this is a stunt," he said through clenched teeth, "then it's an unethical one. You can't just ambush people, humiliate them in public." Evan tilted his head. Calm, measured. "But you weren't ambushed," he said. "You were honest. For the first time in years, maybe. No scripts, no cameras you could pose for, just your reactions to a barefoot boy asking to be heard." He paused. "That's what we documented." Dr. Lena Morales stood slowly from her seat near the front. She stepped forward, her hands still trembling from the performance, her eyes glassy with the weight of everything she'd just witnessed. She walked past Candace, past Whitaker, right to the edge of the stage, and then, with quiet conviction, she spoke. "This boy," she said, her voice clear, "just taught this room more about music and humanity than any keynote ever could." Evan looked down at her, unsure for the first time that evening. Dr. Morales smiled gently. "You played Beethoven," she said, "with a depth I haven't heard from anyone your age in decades, and then you played us." She turned to the crowd. "Everyone in this room claims to care about young artists, underprivileged talent, musical outreach. But when it was right in front of you, living, breathing, hungry, you laughed." The weight of her words fell like snow. "This project," she continued, "isn't an ambush. It's a wake-up call." Candace scoffed. "You think humiliation is the way to fund music education?" Dr. Morales didn't blink. "I think the truth is the only place to start." Silence again. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, someone clapped. Then another. Not everyone joined this time, but enough to feel the tide shifting. Evan stepped back slightly. He didn't bask, didn't smile, just stood there, like the eye of a storm finally clearing. Somewhere in the back, a woman whispered, "Is this going to air?" Evan heard. He nodded. "Next month, national broadcast, streaming platforms, PBS primetime." Panic flickered in the corners. PR agents whispered into earpieces. Foundation members pulled out phones, likely texting crisis consultants. Gerald Whitaker moved to the side, already composing his apology in his head. And still Evan stood grounded. He was just done hiding. Dr. Morales turned to him one last time. "You ready for what comes next?" Evan shrugged. "Wasn't ready for what came before. Didn't stop me then." A small smile. Quiet. Earned. And with that, he stepped down from the stage, not as a trick, not as a story, but as an artist who had just changed the conversation. The room didn't return to normal, because it couldn't. The echo of Evan's truth hadn't even faded before the whispers began. Not applause now, not outrage. Just static, low, nervous murmurs from guests refreshing their news apps, fingers trembling on their screens. Some were already fielding panicked texts from assistants. Others were trying to piece together just how badly they'd been exposed. It didn't take long. On Twitter, a clip from the live stream had already surfaced. Evan's final note, his line, "You weren't being tested. You were being revealed." By the time Candace Sterling reached the back of the hall, Hidden Virtuosos was trending in 3 cities. Evan stood near the edge of the stage, unmoved by the swirl around him. People began approaching, cautiously at first, hands full of business cards, sympathy, fresh-baked platitudes. "Young man, you're brilliant, truly. Do you have a place to stay tonight? What size are you? I think I have a coat in my car." They meant well, or thought they did. Evan nodded politely, accepted none of it. To him, this wasn't a victory parade, it was cleanup. One by one, the donors and dignitaries tried to reframe the narrative, to shift from ignorance to benefactor with nothing but a sentence and a smile. But Evan didn't play along. His face stayed unreadable, calm, detached, not angry, just finished. Whitaker was louder. He pulled over a local reporter who'd arrived mid-fallout and said, Listen, I always encourage young talent. When he asked to play, I knew there was something special. I mean, did you hear him? I was just giving the kid a chance. It would have worked if the full footage hadn't already shown his smirk, his scoff, his performative dare. Candace Sterling was in full damage control mode. "This child was planted here," she said, voice high, breath quick. "This is entrapment, illegal, immoral. I will have this documentary pulled before it airs." Evan, who hadn't spoken since stepping off stage, finally turned toward her. He pulled the RSVP card from his backpack, the one every guest had received digitally and in print. He held it out gently, like a student returning a graded paper. "Page 3, he said. "Section 4A, consent to filming, public broadcast, and redistribution of footage for educational and journalistic purposes." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Candace froze. Her mouth opened, closed. Then she turned sharply and stormed toward the green room. Evan looked down at the card in his hand, folded it neatly, slid it back into his bag. The very same bag he'd carried into shelters, under train seats, across frozen sidewalks. He zipped it shut. He was done. Outside the main doors of the Roosevelt Music Hall, a small crowd had begun to gather. At first, it was just a few people, stragglers from the street, security guards who had stepped outside for air. But then came others, folks who had heard the music from the plaza, passers-by who'd caught a glimpse of the live stream through hotel lobby windows, subway performers who recognized that kind of playing like a fingerprint. When Evan stepped outside, they were waiting. Some clapped, others just nodded, silent but knowing. A man in a faded Bulls jacket said, "We saw you, little bro. We saw you." A woman with a cracked phone screen held up the video. "That was you, right? The kid from the church basement piano? I remember you. You used to play near Jackson." Evan smiled faintly. No media circus, real one of the night. No staged press photos. Just streetlights, cold air, and people who heard truth when it spoke. Dr. Morales followed a few steps behind. She watched as Evan absorbed the scene. No spotlight, no Steinway, just the rhythm of the city wrapping around him again. "You don't have to disappear, you know," she said gently. Evan looked at her. He wasn't surprised she'd come. "I'm not disappearing," he said. "I'm just leaving the stage." He turned to the crowd, gave them a quiet nod, and then began walking. Backpack over one shoulder, shoes still in his hand. The cameras didn't follow him. The audience didn't chase. No limo pulled up. No flashbulbs. Just a boy, alone again, but this time on his own terms. The Roosevelt Music Hall glowed behind him like a relic from another world. Inside, the whispers grew louder, but Evan had already stepped beyond the wreckage, because he hadn't come for revenge. He'd come to be seen. And now, finally, the world was watching. 2 days later, the world hit play. The video dropped quietly at midnight. No trailer, no teaser, just a black screen fading into Evan's voice. "Can I play for food?" That was the title. 7 words. And then chaos. By morning, it was everywhere. Clips raced across platforms. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Reddit. Millions clicked. Millions shared. What started as a social experiment detonated into a cultural moment. The footage didn't flinch. It showed the smirks, the laughter, the raised eyebrows and the turned backs. It captured the derision in Gerald Whittaker's voice, the icy smile of Candace Sterling, and the hush that fell when Evan's fingers touched the keys. The full performance aired uninterrupted. Chopin, Beethoven, blues, gospel. Then came the speech, the reveal, the cameras, the stunned faces of a crowd that never imagined they were the ones being watched. The comment sections lit up like bonfires. "This is the most powerful thing I've seen in years. Gerald Whittaker should never teach another masterclass again." They laughed at him. Then they begged for his silence. "You can't polish soul into someone. This kid was born with it." By lunchtime, the video had crossed 20 million views. By evening, it hit 50. Late-night hosts weighed in. Hashtags swarmed. "Shaks, can he play for food?" "Hidden virtuosos." Evan Churchill. One headline read, "The night classical music got a wake-up call." Whitaker issued a statement. It didn't help. "I was merely giving the boy a chance," it read. "I saw potential in him from the beginning." The internet answered with receipts. Clips of his mockery were stitched next to his apology. Within 24 hours, 2 of his major sponsors dropped him. A third suspended their upcoming ad campaign. A music academy he chaired quietly removed his photo from their website. Candace Sterling's fall was faster. She appeared on morning news, lips tight, hair perfect, insisting she had been misled, used, and taken advantage of. But no one was buying it. The footage didn't lie. She hadn't just dismissed Evan, she'd tried to erase him. By the end of the week, she resigned from 3 charitable boards. An arts columnist summed it up best. The boy they mocked revealed the rot they fund. But for Evan, the noise wasn't the point. He watched the reaction from a quiet guest room in a foster family's house, arranged by Dr. Morales. His phone buzzed non-stop. Scholarship offers, television requests, college recruiters, even a major label executive asking if he'd consider a documentary follow-up, on tour. He turned them all down. "I don't want to play for attention," he told Dr. Morales one night. "I want to play where the music matters, not just where the spotlight shines." She understood. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't defiance. He had already proven what he needed to prove. Now he just wanted to keep playing. The Roosevelt performance was uploaded in full to the Hidden Virtuosos website. So was a page titled "Where to Find and Fund Untapped Talent." In the days that followed, hundreds of music institutions were flooded with emails demanding transparency on how they recruit and support young artists. Public arts programs saw a spike in donations. In an editorial for The Atlantic, a conductor wrote, "Evan Churchill is not an outlier. He is the result of a broken system that keeps brilliance in the margins. His performance wasn't just beautiful, it was indictment and invitation. We have no excuse left to pretend we don't see what's missing." For once, the conversation wasn't about what Evan didn't have. It was about what he'd given. And in the middle of the noise, the headlines, the offers, the outrage, Evan sat by a second-hand upright piano in a quiet Chicago living room, headphones in, eyes closed, fingers dancing over the keys. He wasn't rehearsing. He was remembering. Not the applause, not the stage. Just the cracked tile basement of a church where a woman with gospel in her bones first told him, "You don't play for praise, you play to stay human." That was enough. For now. 6 months later, the world had moved on. Mostly. The headlines had faded, the hashtags slowed. Another story, another scandal, another savant in the spotlight. But Evan Churchill was never interested in staying viral. He was interested in staying honest. He now lived in a modest brownstone on the north side of Chicago, with a family that understood music like language, like air. They weren't rich, they weren't famous, but they were real. A jazz saxophonist foster dad, a gospel singer foster mom, a quiet attic practice room with thick carpets and soundproofed walls, and an old Yamaha upright piano that sounded like a memory when it was played just right. Evan played it every morning, not to rehearse, just to feel. He was enrolled part-time at the Chicago Conservatory, but only under the condition that he could skip recitals and juries unless he wanted to perform. Dr. Morales had made the arrangements herself. "Let the boy study, not prove," she told the board. And so he did. He studied theory with a Juilliard transfer, blues with a session legend from Memphis, gospel composition with his foster mother on Sunday nights, over sweet tea and humming. He didn't talk much in class, but his playing did. It had changed, thicker now, more textured. He blended Chopin with Mahalia Jackson, Bach with brass. His fingers had found a new weight, like he'd finally claimed both halves of himself. No more hunger in his hands, just history. And still, he stayed away from the spotlight, refused every interview after the second week, skipped the award ceremonies, donated most of his prize money to the South Side church that raised him. He turned down a national tour, said no to a major label offer. "I don't want to be famous," he told Dr. Morales. "I just want to play and mean it." She nodded, proud. "Then that's what you'll do." But some stages come whether you chase them or not. So it didn't feel like selling out when the letter came from New York. Carnegie Hall, a debut performance, sponsored by the Hidden Virtuosos Initiative. No price tag, no pressure. Just one night, one piano, one set of hands telling a story no one could rewrite. Evan didn't answer right away. He let the envelope sit on his windowsill for 2 weeks, unopened, collecting sun and dust. He played blues in the meantime, practiced slow hymns and fragments of Ravel, wondering if Dorothy May would have thought he was ready. It was for her, and for the train stations, and the cracked basement tile, and the boy who once played invisible just to feel real again. That's how he ended up here. On a brisk fall morning, coat zipped to the chin, standing across the street from Carnegie Hall, watching a crew hang posters for the weekend's performers. One by one they went up, bold fonts, famous faces. Then came his, Evan Churchill, solo piano recital, one night only. The poster didn't say prodigy or viral sensation or miracle, just his name. He stood there for a while, didn't cross the street, didn't take a photo, just watched the paper catch wind and settle flat against the marquee glass. Then he smiled. Not for the crowd, not for the critics, for Dorothy May, for the street performances no one tipped, for the subway hymns and the gospel roots and the blues runs that saved his spirit, long before any institution ever recognized him. He smiled because this moment wasn't about arrival. It was about endurance. A boy born into silence, raised on struggle and carved into sound. The world had heard him once. Now, it would have no choice but to listen again. Because in the end, it wasn't just about music, it was about soul. And as he turned to walk into the wind, one final line echoed in his mind, the one Dorothy used to whisper during stormy nights and broken strings. You can't teach soul, but if you survive long enough with music in your bones, the world will have no choice but to hear it.